Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States owes over $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. Europe owes $14 trillion. China owes trillions more. And when you add everything together, governments, corporations, households, humanity owes $315 trillion. That is 3 times more than the total economic output of the entire planet. But here is the paradox. Almost no one notices. If everyone owes money, who is actually owed? Who is the creditor? Who is on the other side of this equation? Who is collecting interest on a debt so large that mathematically, physically, and economically, it can never be repaid? Most people assume the answer must be foreign governments, or wealthy nations, or some secret elite group. But the truth is far stranger. Because when you trace the ownership of the debt, when you follow the bonds, the institutions, the asset managers, the central banks, you discover something unsettling. The world doesn't owe money to an outside force. The world owes money to itself. It's a closed loop, a self-referential machine, a system where debt is created, transferred, repackaged, refinanced, and paid endlessly, but never eliminated. And this system did not appear naturally. It was engineered, piece by piece, layer by layer, by 4 men across 4 centuries. For architects who solved 4 different problems, but unintentionally built one global structure. A structure that makes debt permanent, profitable, and inescapable. None of them knew the future. None of them predicted the scale. But each one created a mechanism that locked every government and every citizen into a system that now governs the entire world. This is the story of how we got here. How debt became the foundation of the global economy. How governments became dependent on borrowing. How banks became the masters of money creation. And why the system cannot be undone without collapsing everything built on top of it. If you think debt is a problem, you're missing the point. Debt is the operating system. And today, you're going to see how it was programmed. For most of human history, debt was simple. A king or ruler needed money. He borrowed it from wealthy merchants or nobles. They agreed on interest. And later, the king either paid the debt, or he refused to. Default was common. Lenders took the loss. Life moved on. Debt was transactional, not structural. It did not define the financial system. It did not expand infinitely. It did not govern geopolitics. It was a tool, not a pillar. If a kingdom mismanaged its finances, it suffered. If a noble lent to the wrong king, he suffered. Debt was local, limited, and self-correcting. But in the late 1600s, war began changing everything. England and France were locked in repeated conflicts. War became more expensive. Armies grew larger. Navies required ships, metal, timber, gunpowder. The old borrowing model couldn't sustain it. Kings needed more money, faster, with more predictability. Merchants wanted security and guarantees. Both sides needed a new system. And one man, a Scottish merchant named William Paterson, had the idea that changed global finance forever. William Paterson was a failed entrepreneur with a brilliant mind for financial engineering. In 1691, England was desperate. King William III needed money to wage war against France. Traditional lenders were hesitant. England had defaulted before. Trust was low. Paterson saw an opportunity, a solution that would change civilization. He proposed loaning the government 1.2 million pounds, an enormous figure at the time. But the innovation wasn't the amount. It was the terms. Paterson's idea was revolutionary. The loan would never be repaid. Not the principal, only the interest. Forever. In exchange, the lenders would receive guaranteed interest, backed by Parliament and the government's taxation power. And to manage all this, Paterson proposed creating a new institution. The Bank of England. This institution would hold the merchant's gold, lend it to the government, and issue paper notes representing the debt. That was the innovation. Debt became tradable paper. Paper became money, and money became something the government could create by borrowing more. This was not a conspiracy. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. But it set a trap. For the first time in history, national debt became permanent. A government no longer borrowed money and paid it back. It paid interest endlessly, and the debt itself, the IOUs, became the foundation of the currency. Debt created money. More debt created more money. And since the principal was never repaid, the system had only one direction: upward. Forever. Within decades, other European powers copied it. France, the Netherlands, eventually the United States. The debt trap had begun. Pattison built the foundation, but the next architect scaled it into an empire. By the early 1800s, Europe was a battleground. Napoleon's wars had drained treasuries. Governments needed cash quickly, in huge quantities. Traditional lenders couldn't keep up. Then came the Rothschilds, 5 brothers in 5 major European cities: London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, Naples. They didn't invent government bonds, but they transformed them. Nathan Rothschild in London created something new: a secondary market for sovereign debt. Instead of lending directly to governments, the Rothschilds bought bonds at a discount and sold them to investors. Governments got their money immediately. Investors got a tradable asset, and Rothschild took the spread. But his real innovation was deeper. He made debt international, borderless, interconnected. A British bond might be owned by a Dutch investor, sold to a German bank, used as collateral by an Italian noble, and refinanced through a French fund. Debt became global, and that meant default became dangerous. Before Rothschild, if a king defaulted, lenders lost money, and life moved on. After Rothschild, a default didn't hurt one creditor. It risked collapsing an entire European financial network. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying. They had to keep borrowing. Not because they were responsible, but because now the system depended on them. Debt had become inescapable. The trap tightened, but the next architect made it even bigger and far harder to unwind. At the turn of the 20th century, America was becoming a global power, but its financial system was chaotic. Banks were independent. Money supply depended on gold. There was no coordinated mechanism to stabilize crises. Then came the panic of 1907. Banks failed. The stock market collapsed. The economy seized, and one man stepped in: J.P. Morgan. He gathered the biggest bankers in his private library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own money to save the system. It worked, but Morgan was old. He couldn't keep doing it, so he and his associates engineered a solution secretly. In 1910, at Jekyll Island, a private meeting created the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. The brilliance was in the design. It wouldn't be called a central bank. It would appear decentralized with 12 regional banks. It would appear democratic, with government-appointed board members. But control would rest with the private banks that owned the system. And most importantly, the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government debt, which means when the government issues a bond, the Fed prints new money to buy it. The government spends the money, and taxpayers pay interest on money that never existed before. This mechanism removed all limits. Governments could borrow endlessly. The Fed would always buy. Debt became infinite. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it unlimited. There was only one step left, making it truly unavoidable. By the 1970s, inflation was spiraling. The US dollar was losing credibility. Foreign nations doubted America's ability to maintain value. Then Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve. He made a brutal decision. He raised interest rates to 20%. It stopped inflation, but shattered developing nations. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed billions at low rates in the 1970s. When Volcker raised rates, their interest payments tripled. They couldn't pay. In 1982, Mexico announced it would default. If that happened, major American banks would collapse. The global system would break. Volcker had a choice: let the banks take losses, or protect the system. He protected the system. He used the International Monetary Fund to bail out debtor nations, not to forgive their debt, but to restructure it. IMF loans came with harsh conditions: spending cuts, privatization, currency devaluation, asset sales. These programs didn't reduce debt. They extended it. They locked nations into permanent interest payments. Volcker created the global enforcement mechanism. When countries can't pay, they aren't allowed to default. They are refinanced into permanent debt. And the interest keeps flowing up the ladder to the same institutions that hold the world's bonds. The trap was now global and total. Now consider how the system operates today. The US issues $38 trillion in debt. Who holds it? About $20 trillion is held by domestic institutions: banks, pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers, and the Federal Reserve. These institutions are owned by the wealthy. Interest, about $1 trillion per year, flows into them. The remaining debt is held by government trust funds and foreign investors, but even those merely rotate the money within the system. Taxes flow from workers to government to bondholders to financial institutions. It is a continuous transfer of wealth upward. Now multiply that system by Japan, Europe, China, India, Brazil, and the entire developing world. Every country owes money to institutions that depend on interest. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it will be refinanced. Debt will grow forever because paying it off would collapse the money supply. Debt is money, money is debt. The system can't exist without both. And because every nation's debt is held by other nations and institutions, default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. Debt has become the operating system of civilization. If the US repaid its debt, trillions of dollars would vanish from the economy. The money supply would shrink. Deflation would crush markets. Banks would fail. Pensions would implode. Governments would become insolvent. The same is true globally. Paying off debt is not an option. It is mathematically impossible without destroying the system. So governments keep borrowing. Central banks keep buying. Institutions keep collecting interest. Workers keep paying. This is not a conspiracy. It's architecture. For architects, for centuries, one global system. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it inescapable. None of them collaborated. None of them foresaw the outcome. But their innovations aligned into a single structure, a structure where governments borrow forever. Money is created from debt. Institutions collect interest endlessly, and taxpayers support the system without ever seeing it. Debt is not a problem governments are trying to solve. Debt is the business model. Understanding this is the first real step to understanding how the world works. Not through democracy, not through ideology, but through financial architecture. If this opened your eyes, remember, no one will teach you this in school. Governments won't explain it. Banks won't admit it. Economists won't emphasize it. But this is the machine we live inside. A machine that runs on debt, grows through debt, and survives only if debt expands forever. You cannot escape it. But now, at least, you can see it. Thank you for watching.